So I reached out broadly on Twitter for people to speak with about really any range of assorted topics, mostly economics, but it could be political too. And you reached out and wanted to speak broadly about capitalism and socialism and the preferences between the two systems. So you're a socialist, and so why? How about you tell me why you're a socialist?
Sure. So I differ, I think, a lot from a lot of socialists, or at least traditional Marxists.
Sure.
Um, for me, it's more so about less so some kind of like issue with equality or inequality, those sorts of things, or a kind of a more efficient system. It's more so just a matter of freedom and reaching a more, I guess you say, more genuine or realizable form of freedom than the
Freedom.
current one we think about. Yes.
Okay, so how does your version of socialism walk me through your version of socialism and tell me how does it maximize, how does it optimize a person's individual freedom?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. So when we talk about freedom, we have to differentiate what we're talking about when we mean it. So when I talk about freedom, I don't mean just like the sort of standard conception of I can do more things, I have more choices in like what I can do. So the way I think about it is under our current system, our conceptualization of freedom might be something like, being able to have more say, or having more political rights, but also it could also mean having more choices when it comes to like what you can buy or sell. And what I say is, I don't think having choices in what you can own or what you can buy or sell, the sort of consumeristic mindset, is really a genuine conception of freedom. I think it's a more shallow understanding. So for me, when I talk about freedom, what I'm talking about is a freedom that is free of coercion or a freedom that is free of more, I guess you could say oppressing forces so that you can pursue a more free society. And so with that in mind, you know, it's hard for me to conceptualize some like exact system that
Sure.
captures this perfectly. But I'll tell you, generally speaking, um, the ways in which this freedom is currently curtailed, or else, I guess you say, dampered, under the current system. And I guess I can go from there if you want, but I'm not sure if you're following me so far.
I am following you. I think I've talked about this before, and I feel like capitalism uh doesn't necessarily have coercion baked into it.
Hmm.
I don't think that I think that you can have a capitalist system with either equal or less coercion than a socialist system. Uh, and I think that it's valuable to strive towards that system versus a socialist system because it is proven to work, and there are structural issues with socialism and socialist economies that I feel like cannot be resolved. They're internal um, I don't want to say internal contradictions, but there's structural issues with socialism that I don't think can be resolved, and I think it would hurt quality of living and growth broadly. So that's why I would prefer more of a managed, regulated capitalist type system versus a socialist one.
And I guess the main contention here is I don't think that those. I guess I'd ask you what you think those contradictions in socialism are, but also I would ask you, you know, the kinds of measurements you're using and how you're choosing to evaluate these systems. Um, because I think, there isn't such a thing as sort of this objective, sort of empirical look at these systems. And ultimately, when we're valuing a system, it's always going to come down to a moral um, set of values, principles, preferences, whatever you want to call it. And so when we assess the system, we're going off those moral values, and that's what we're projecting onto them. So I would say that, well, two things. I would ask you what those contradictions for socialism are that you're talking about, but also more broadly how you're going about assessing those contradictions or issues that you see.
Sure. So I think this is why I asked more specifically what your social system would look like because it would depend on the system. I think that the flavor of the day is market socialism. I would say,
Mhm.
and I would say that the issues with those systems are that you end up with a lot of structural. unemployment. It becomes a lot more expensive to hire. It does become is possible to, but it does become harder to scale. In some industries, really benefit from scale. I think that uh, capital funding and liquidity are real problems in market socialist systems, because when workers are the owners of the means of production, they naturally they own an equity in a company, and so I think that they're gonna there's gonna be there's not really as much of a such thing as like public ownership in the sense of like the stock market, raising capital, things like that. I think that investment becomes a big problem. Credit scores all of a sudden become tied to your actual employment, which I think would hurt a lot of people. If you take it into an American context, I think that would specifically prevent a lot of uh, lower income people from getting jobs because oftentimes they have poor credit scores. And so I think there's a lot of things baked into inherent in any financial system, whether socialist or capitalist, that doesn't really work out in a market socialist framework. But what I would say is that in terms of representative rights, in terms of political rights, in terms of individual freedom and collective freedom, you can accomplish all of those things under a capitalist framework. And I would argue that under that framework, you would have more freedom than you would under a socialist framework.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things here again. So, I mean, I don't want to sound like this, but I think you're projecting issues or certain concepts of capitalism onto a socialist system. Like I think you brought up credit scores and sort of equity. And while market socialism, I think is preferable, it's not the system uh, I would necessarily advocate for in and of itself. Um, because a lot of the issues we're talking about, come from a mindset that we're, applying what currently exists now to what exists in the future. And simply put, I don't think that's necessarily the most, I guess you say, productive way of thinking about it. Because when we're talking about socialism, we're not talking about capitalism, but retweaked, and we have like we give workers like stocks or whatever. That's not really what socialism is. Socialism is a bit more profound than that, or a profound is a little pretentious. I don't know what the right word is. It's a bit more than that. It's more so that we're returning the means of production, and you might think that is just through equity, or you might think that's just through a stock, but more so it's that workers actually have the ability and control over their lives, over their businesses, which sounds abstract, but I think you can actually think about it in more concrete terms. And I'm sure you've heard all this stuff before, but essentially, you know, what I'm trying to get at is that it's not so much that you can project what you currently see now to what could be. Um, yeah, I kind of lost where I was going with that. What else? Oh, sorry, what else did you say?
Well, yeah, I think this is one of the problems. That's why often with these debates I try to start out with, what your flavor of socialism is because you're
Yeah.
speaking in vagaries and I think that it's not purposeful on your point. I'm not trying to say that you're obfuscating, but what I am trying to say is that I think when you speak in vagaries, you inadvertently or advertently uh sort of hand wave a lot of the very specific details of a broad system of economics. I think you know
Mm.
socialism is deeper than economics. Well, I don't really think it is. I mean, socialism is an economic system, and economics. We can analyze the economics of the mercantilist economy, despite the fact that it wasn't broadly capitalist. Right? We can analyze the economics of the Soviet Union from an internal standpoint, despite the fact that it was largely decommodified, that it was a centrally planned economy for the most part. So I mean, I economics is the science of the distribution of scarce resources. So it doesn't really have to be, um, you say it's a capitalist framing to talk about credit scores or talk about equity ownership. I mean, it's really just a framing of how virtually any financial or economic system uh, would likely need to run. If you talk to me about a world without credit scores, there's a lot of other problems. If you talk to me, to a world without equity ownership, there's a lot of other problems with that as well. So I mean, a lot of the hand waves just end up snowballing into bigger and bigger problems for your system.
Okay, so there's a few things there again. So you say basically that socialism is just an economic system. Basically, if I'm correct about that, that's your understanding of it. But like for me, as I've said before, I think it's more than that. I think it's like a moral position, and you can prescribe more to socialism than it just being an economic arrangement. It's the same thing. Like the way I think about it is when we talk about something like veganism, we can talk about issues relating to diets or environmental concerns. But ultimately, when we're talking about something like veganism, we're talking about a moral concern with sentient life. In this same way, when we talk about socialism, we're not just talking about an economic arrangement. We're talking about, you know, a basically the autonomy and the sort of freedom or rights that we give to workers and their ability to, self-determine for themselves what they want. And simply put, under capitalism, so long as so basically capitalism, from my understanding, from the way I think about it, is it perpetuates and it necessitates an underclass of people, and that underclass is subservient to that dominant class. And so because of this, I guess you could say relationship, it necessitates that there shall always be someone to be oppressed upon or someone to be exploited for whatever purposes, mainly profit. But the point being is that in such a system, you cannot expect, a truly free society. In the same way, you cannot expect a society that still, has and treats animals, as food or, as ends in of themselves. Even if people treat their animals nicely, they take them for walks, they feed them, they give them room. If at the end of the day, those animals are still ultimately used to be exploited and, ultimately killed, that doesn't make an ethical or moral system. It just makes a slightly more preferable system. So I would say to you that, if even if we look to like the Nordic model or any kind of social democratic country in Europe, while that is preferable to what we have here in the United States, it ultimately isn't a moral ethical arrangement because it's still, you know, propositioned on this relationship, I guess you could say.
Well, sure, I understand that, but again, this is where uh, the vagary of your specific system kind of comes into play again, because unless you're talking about a very theoretical, I would argue, relatively impossible system to implement, there's not going to be a
Mhm.
total horizontal distribution of power in a socialist system, right? Even in a
Not
in a
expecting that.
market. Well, right, but you're saying capitalism necessitates inequality and necessitates, class deviations of people, but socialism does the
Hmm.
same thing. Now, you might argue, for instance, I think in my conversation with Socialism Done Left, he mentioned that, well, socialism has a lot less inequality. It's like, okay, well, fair enough, but if the value, if you're making the statement that, um, I just value a classless sort of equal society, right? That's what I'm going for. Well, socialism doesn't get you there, right? And I think that what gets you there
Understandably.
better, well, I think what gets you to, essentially a more equal society rather is just, a capitalist system where you have reasonable worker representation, unionization, and an equitable tax system. And that's been proven to work. I mean, we can criticize the Nordic economies, but the reality is it's a free market private economy that is very, very equal in the grand scheme of things. So I think that's really the model we would strive for. It seems like every time socialism has been attempted, there's been uh, either or a lot of political unrest and or a lot of economic instability that ultimately leads to either the country's downfall or transition away from the system in favor of more market reforms.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we're talking about something like the Nordic model as kind of the, I guess, the go-to or the ideal, um, I think once again we're coming to the question of what are we measuring when it comes to an egalitarian society, or what are we measuring when it comes to equality? Because I would argue, while in some ways those systems have done a good job, um, the problems with it necessitate that there's always going to be underlying issues that make it both unsustainable, but also conditional. So what do I mean by this? Well, it's unsustainable in the sense that, you know, the Nordic model, social democratic countries in Europe, the problems with them is that these kinds of models are not, you can't implement them in something like the third world because they're propositioned on certain realities. Those realities being imperialism, but also being the kind of, I guess you call it, investment in relationships with the United States. So European countries, I mean, I don't think this is new news or anything, but the reason they have the kinds of wealth they have is not simply because they are inherently better countries or that, they just trade good or whatever. It's because they've exploited the third world. They exploited countries like Africa for their resources and wealth. And this wealth has been concentrated in such a way where they're able to create the kinds of welfare states that they have created and thus have, brought about the kinds of, you know, social democratic reforms that they have. And even countries like Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, even if they didn't directly have colonies, they have benefited tremendously from this relationship by being able to trade with these countries and be in the same sort of proximity of these countries where that wealth can overflow. So that's the one thing. But it's also conditional. When we look to countries like Germany, for instance, after the Second World War, the reasons they were able to come about and create the robust economy that they have to come about with these social democratic reforms is due to massive investments from the United States via the Marshall Plan. So these realities are very contingent on certain, um, historical trends. It's based on certain material conditions, so these systems cannot be just implemented anywhere. They're based on certain things, certain kinds of exploitation, certain kinds of other actors. So when we talk about these systems and how, they're more free or what have you, um, free in what way? Free in what sense? Because to me, I don't think a system that is conditional upon other nations and also has only got there, or maybe mostly got there due to exploiting other nations, is really that free of society. And lastly, I would have to know like what measurements you mean by more egalitarian, because I think that's going to be the crux of what our problems are in this.
Yeah, sure. So I think that it's a little ironic what you've brought up here in a certain sense. So, on one hand, we're saying that the wealth of northern, the global north is based on the exploitation of the global south, which I think in part is correct. There's probably some percentage of GDP that or total wealth creation that's based on exploitation. It's hard to determine those numbers, and I think that's why socialists mention it a lot. That it's I'm not sure if it's like 80% of the living standard of the global north is based on exploitation of global south, but it's probably some percentage. I'll grant you. And while at the same time you're saying that's necessary, there has to be exploitation. You also mentioned the Marshall Plan, right? Which was, you're saying one of the reasons that the European economy has survived was because the Marshall Plan existed. Well, the Marshall Plan was, I looked it up just now. It was about $100 billion. I've never put a dollar amount in my head to the Marshall Plan, but it was about $100 billion worth of today's money going to Europe, right? And
Hmm.
so, we spent like $5 trillion stimulating the economy. So I think the prospect of a capitalist economy sending money over to countries in order to help them develop is a perfectly reasonable expectation. I don't think that that cannot happen in a capitalist framework. Like you mentioned, it's already happened under a capitalist framework when we sent $100 billion over to Europe for them to rebuild after World War II. So, I don't think that
So,
that would
so
be well.
my
Let
point,
me
my
let,
point.
let me let
Okay,
me finish
go
really
ahead.
quick. One more second.
Okay.
Um, so I don't think that that would be impossible, and I think also today, when you look at the actual percentage of the global north economy today that's reliant on imports or trade, economic activity from the global south, not actually that much. We're talking between 3 and 5% of GDP across the global north that's based on trade with the global south. That is certainly something that can be reformed. But what I would say also is that you don't necessarily want less trade with the global south. Rather, what you want rather is just a more equitable trade system, and that's something that can certainly be accomplished in a capitalist framework. It's been accomplished before.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. My point was when I was trying to cut in there was that my point wasn't that, you know having other capitalist countries invest in other capitalist countries is, couldn't happen in our capitalist framework. My point is that these social democratic countries, they aren't they aren't coming about on their own merits as other capitalist countries are. So it's not like, it just emerges and that this is the best system. It's emergent because we have allowed it to emerge. We've allowed it to emerge through our investment. So the Marshall Plan is demonstrative of the fact that these systems aren't necessarily just solely better than all the other systems. They just work better. They work because we have allowed them to work. They work because we invest so much money into them that they can survive, you know?
Well,
So that's my main point.
capitalism didn't sprout out of the ground. I mean, it had to start somewhere
Sure.
when it was a minority system, and it grew because it was very successful. And I guess unfortunately for your
By the
case,
same metric, can I not say that in some ways that's the same as socialism, right?
well,
Because in some
socialism
ways,
every time it's
so
been tried, it's failed. It hasn't been sustainable
in
every
what
time
way
it's
though?
been tried.
This is the issue. What way do you mean has it failed or not succeed? It doesn't last, it hasn't lasted today? Like what are you talking about? I'm not really sure.
Well, again, this is when it comes back to my point. When it depends on your flavor of socialism. Now, there have
Yeah.
been I would say that there's probably two functional, uh, real arguable versions of socialism, right? So I wouldn't count. Some people would call like Richard Wolff, for instance. Sometimes he would label like social democracy as a type of socialism, which I don't think most people would agree with
Mhm.
today. But
Sure.
um, I would say a market socialist system and a more centrally planned system or a mix of the two would kind of be the spectrum of like modern implementation of socialism. There have been market socialist systems that have been tried before. They struggled with the exact same things that I just mentioned. And there
Mhm.
have been centrally planned systems that have existed, and they've also struggled very deeply. I think that, well, to be fair though, I think arguably I think state capitalism could arguably be a form of socialism. Ironically enough, it would depend on who I'm talking to in that regard. But
It depends.
if we're not counting China as socialism, um, there's really not been examples of successful forms of socialism. And at the very least, I would say that there hasn't been, even if you count China as a socialist system, there haven't been successful examples of socialism implemented that maintain any sort of democratic structure. They seem to devolve into authoritarianism rather quickly, and I think that that's probably counter to your goal of maximizing individual or collective freedom.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to be rude, but you're accusing me of vagaries and you kind of engage in the same thing. But because when we're
Well,
talking
I can
about
mention several examples if you want. I mean, we can talk about
yeah,
Cuba,
so,
Vietnam, China that all devolved into authoritarianism. Soviet Union that did the same thing and eventually collapsed. Yugoslavia that was a market socialist system but struggled with inflation and unemployment and private investment, or well, I should say capital raising in the case of a market socialist system, and they
yeah,
eventually collapsed as well. So I mean, Chile, for instance, struggled deeply with socialism even before the coup. The Pinochet government, it didn't have a sustainable economic model either. So,
wait,
you
do
know,
you think okay, go
Venezuela, for instance, would be another instance of, arguably socialism failing. And I think, and devolving into authoritarianism. So, you know, specific
so is your
examples.
so your criteria is authoritarianism and whether or not they are, I guess, economically sustainable. Is that what you mean by failures then?
Yeah, I would say that a system is a failure, or the system of government is a failure if it does not deliver services to the people, if it is not sustainable in the sense that it's internally stable, in the sense that it doesn't have strong institutions, very basic sort of definitions of what makes a state. Having strong institutions that are credible, that are deliverable, that maintain some quality of life for its people, for an extended period of time. And I do think that there are systems around today that call themselves socialists, but really aren't in actual practical implementation. They're more just
Mhm.
authoritarian systems. I think really the closest thing to socialism today that is around is probably Cuba. Um, But I think Cuba also has a lot of internal economic problems that we can't just blame all on the United States. So there's a lot of problems it seems when socialism is in.
Sure. I mean, I'll say there certainly can be problems, but what I'll say that, when it comes to authoritarianism, I don't think that's a uniquely socialist problem, for one. I mean, I'm not saying that you're saying that, but that's kind of the framing I was getting from that. So I'm sorry if I'm misinterpreting you. Because, I mean, if we want to talk about, a country that by all metrics is a very successful and is also capitalist, we can also just point to something like Singapore, right? And that is a incredibly authoritarian country. So I don't think this issue of authoritarianism is unique. And more so to the point, I guess.
Well,
Sorry, I'm just trying
Singapore.
to.
Well, what I would say is that you're right. That's one criteria. Why collect your thoughts? That's one criteria. Yes. But you have to keep in mind that Singapore, they do have elections. They have high turnout in those elections. Now there are, it's certainly. I don't
Okay.
think it's quite arguable that Singapore is a totally free and fair democracy because it's not. It's not. It's more of like a it's not as bad as an Iranian sort of style democracy, but it's farther to the democracy spectrum than Iran is. But at the same time, people do vote and participate. But at the same time, the other quality metrics, maintaining a quality of life for its citizens. I think having strong and credible institutions. I mean, Singapore seems to do that quite well. So not to defend their political system to any degree, but there's multiple metrics. For instance, if yeah, I don't know what you'd score on this scale, but if a system was like just a total supreme leader dictatorship, but at the same time everyone was basically happy with their life and everyone had a really high quality of living, maybe it gets a 60% on the test or something. I don't know, but there's an equation you have to come up with in your head to determine like the efficacy of a political system. And what I'm just saying is that socialism does not seem to accomplish your goal of maximizing individual freedom or collective freedom in practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really talk about specific examples because whenever we talk about specific example, we're going to come up with counter examples. I can for every example you talk about socialism, I can just point to another country that's capitalist and say
Well, but what I think that you can't
this.
do though is like you can't do what I can do, which is point to many many successful examples of socialist countries. I can point to many many many, hundreds of successful examples of capitalist countries, and I think that's a real problem when you're advocating for a political system that, when tried, seems to perpetually fail.
Okay, well, my point. Okay, so if we're going by this, could it not be said 500 years ago, 700 years ago? If we went back to feudalist times, they could just say the same thing. What do you mean capitalism? There hasn't been a successful capitalist project. There are all these weird revolutions that happen for liberalism, what have you, and they get crushed. It doesn't seem very sustainable or successful. Let's just stick to feudalism. So, like, I'm not going to engage with this because if we can apply the same logic, then I don't think that's a very valid argument to say just because it hasn't worked so far doesn't mean that it's not conceivable that we could have a system like that, right? You know what I'm saying?
I think I would disagree because there have been natural experiments and natural examples of capitalism cropping up on its own, and those have also been
But
successful. I mean, for instance, the origin of the Chinese market reforms was a natural origin. It was farmers disregarding the central planning authority and keeping the means of their own productions to themselves and keeping the fruits of their labor to themselves. And what the Chinese authority found was that they were actually much more productive when they were able to privately cultivate their agriculture rather than having these commune systems that the Chinese government implemented. And so, I think that the fact that private organization has shown to essentially naturally crop up and sort of indirectly directly whatever be better than either a centrally planned or a market socialist system. China tried both. uh, I think is a hell of a lot of evidence that my system is more innate. It's effective provably, whereas again it does seem that whenever socialism crops up, it's often on the back of a lot of angry fervor. Even if you could argue it crops up naturally, it does seem to be unsustainable, doesn't seem to be stable. And like I said, at the very, very, very least, it has a hell of a problem with scaling um, that can theoretically be addressed, but hasn't been practically addressed in any of the examples. So I think that that's the difference between, going 1,000 years ago and talking about capitalism's impossible. Well, capitalism sprouted up naturally, and it's been able to sustain itself throughout, the last 500 years or something like that. However, argue whenever capitalism started, but it's quite a tried and true tested system, whereas socialism for the last 150, 200 years has been, a tried and tested and robust failure. So I think it's important for you to engage in those examples, at least because uh, I think that they're devastating to your point, and so it's probably worth you engaging in those examples.
My point is that we can't it's not that we can't learn from them. My point is that just looking to examples and saying, "Oh, I guess it can't work," I don't think it's a very fair assessment of this. The reason I was bringing up these sort of feudalist examples is because if we went, all those years ago, there wouldn't be an example of a successful capitalist project because they all either failed or they were crushed. So, by the same logic, I don't think it's a fair assessment just to look at the failed examples and not go, how can we learn from this? But instead go, you see, this is a failure. There's nothing to this. Let's just move on. The point is that, yes, we can look at these systems, we can look at these failed experiments, if you want to call them that, and we can learn from them and understand how you can improve from them. But to simply just go, well, it's a failure, let's move on, I don't think it's a fair assessment. So that's generally how I come at it. But, like I said before, I don't think it's a very productive use of our time just to go back and forth with examples. Like,
Well,
for
sure.
me,
Here's what
ultimately
I
comes
would
down
say
to
then. I think
reality.
let's move on from that then, and let's say I think you can improve from those systems by implementing what I'm talking about, which is a social democratic, more regulated, capitalist society. I feel like I've addressed the inequality argument, the idea that it necessitates class structure in society. I think socialism does the same thing. But what capitalism does do very well, which I would love to hear you to respond to, is it effectively has shown to be able to grow the economy, give you a strong tax base to tax from and redistribute from, and capitalism has proven to be compatible with generally liberal democracy and allow people representative voice in their government, which socialism hasn't proven to be able to do. So, how do you answer those things? I feel like regulated capitalism, is the answer to failed socialism, as well as the answer to unequal capitalism.
Mhm. I could do those, but I have to go point by point. So you can tell me your first point then?
So my first point was that I feel like capitalism, social democratic, sort of regulated capitalism, is the answer to failed socialism in the sense that it gives you growth, it gives you a broad tax base that you can redistribute from, and in conjunction with that point, capitalism has proven to be reconcilable, to be amicable to a democratic framework, that capitalist systems have proven to be able to coexist with a democratic framework of government, which I feel maximizes our individual and collective liberties.
Okay. So your main points are growth was the second one, creating a tax base. The third one was political rights and I guess protecting liberal democracy. And your last one was
Sure.
what exactly?
Those are
Okay.
pretty much the three main points.
Okay. So for growth, I don't contest that capitalism is great for growth. I think Marx even agreed to this, so I'm not going to disagree with you that
He did.
capitalism is great for growth.
Sure.
I believe so. I mean, I believe Marx has contended that yes, capitalism is very good at growing the economy. I don't
He
think
did.
he's
Yeah,
ever
I'm
contested.
I'm agreeing. Because his
So okay,
view was that you had to have capitalism to generate the wealth necessary to
yeah,
transition to socialism, which eventually would
yes,
transition you to communism.
sorry, I was just confused what you were saying. Yes, dude, but yeah, okay. So we agree on that. To your second point, in terms of creating a broad tax base, I guess so. For me, that's not really the qualifier for what makes a successful or sustainable system. In theory, if we could, create a limited tax system and just have more, I guess, autonomous, decentralized, whatever you want to call it, that would work just fine. In terms of the question on political freedoms and I guess liberal democracy more broadly, so looking to the examples that we usually look to in terms of like Soviet Union, so on. I agree with you. I think those kinds of freedoms have been curtailed, and that is a problem. But what I will say more broadly is that you know I don't think liberal democracy is necessarily the truest form of democracy. So I wouldn't, while I think it's better than authoritarianism, I would also seek to create something more than that. So, when we think about liberal democracy, there are certain constraints that are always going to exist. And I think these constraints are inherently tied to capital and its existence. So, what do I mean by this? Well, I mean by this in a few ways. When we talk about, you know, someone's representation in a democracy, someone's ability to act, workers don't have the same kinds of political or at least economic, I'll say economic power as capital does. And so capital will have certain influence over those in power, right? I mean, the most obvious example is with, campaign finance and lobbying, those sorts of things. But this goes more deeply and more fundamentally to just, how class interests work and how those with more power, more economic power, are going to influence those with political power through numerous other avenues. I'm sure we can go down them if you wanted to, but those would be I guess, my main answers, I suppose.
Sure. So I think we can move past the growth point since you've kind of agreed with it. The point on the tax base was that the type of redistribution that often market socialist systems or even I think most market socialist systems would have some component of central planning or decommodification from the state, but or central planning. I'll kind of sidestep central planning because I think you get into this weird argument of like technically a lot of centrally planned economies didn't have a lot of taxes, but that was because they just they planned everything, so they sold their products for a profit, so that's how they got their money for the state. But
Mhm.
um, to move on to the third point, I think that in terms of liberal democratic frameworks and the influence of capital in our democracy, I agree. I think to a certain extent you're right that capital has an outsized influence on our democracy, but when you look at broad trends over time, look at the past 100 years, the economy has become more and more redistributed by the government. I think that if you look at the proportion of the economy that is collected in tax revenue, it's gone from like 15 or 20% in the early 1900s to
Mhm.
35 or 40% today, and in like the Nordic economies, it's well above
Mhm.
40%, even sometimes reaching 50%. A majority of the economy is taxed and redistributed based on taxes. That depends on the year. To be fair, that hasn't been a sustainable thing, but you can even oftentimes people will mention places like Norway where a majority of the total wealth of the nation is actually owned by the state and conversely by the people. So, I think that what is true is what I said before is that it is proven that it is possible, and I would say even in an American framework, it is very well compatible to have a capitalist system that's fair and representative and equitable. The question of equality is a tax question. It's an economic question. It's not necessarily a mode of production or political question. I just think that capitalism has proven to be a better system for growth, establishing that tax base, and then thusly being compatible with a democratic framework so that you can actually get those programs passed. Because, um, for all the one-off stories of, oh, the conservatives in the UK are thinking about cutting the NHS, or conservatives in Canada are talking about getting rid of welfare or universal credit and stuff like that. The truth is, the trend over time is that all of these countries have moved to more and more redistributive programs as the countries have become richer. There's been more money to redistribute, and go from there. You can have a system, ironically, with billionaires that do have outsized influence, but ultimately the outsized influence doesn't seem to overtake the overwhelming influence of the people and what they want. I think that some people would consider what I've just said naive, but it's just an empirical fact that the economies have become more and more controlled by the broad voting populace than capital owners over time.
So basically, what you're saying is that when we look to, like, I assume you're talking about the Nordic countries and more social democratic countries, that their ability to, I guess, redistribute wealth more effectively is kind of nullified, or at least, dampered the sort of economic power that capital owners have. Is that correct?
Well,
What
I
were you
think I think to add one thing onto that that's very important. This is a trend that's been seen across virtually every country. So I mean, if you look at almost every country in the global north, if you look from 1900 or like whenever the country was founded to today, a way higher percentage of the economy is redistributed by the government in a democratic under a democratic framework. So I think that to me shows that there's quite an example of essentially of the economy being more controlled by the people, but also the fact that if you bisect it and look at just social spending, things on like welfare and healthcare spending and unemployment and social security stuff, that percentage has gone up precipitously across the developed world as well. So I think um, people spending as well has gone up quite a bit.
Okay, well, I can't speak to the data because I haven't looked at that specifically. But I'll say this. I don't think necessarily that redistributing wealth for like welfare programs and that sort of stuff doesn't take away from the power that capital actually holds. Um, it certainly scares capital. It certainly scares owners, right? Because they're gonna have to pay more. But ultimately, this doesn't actually address the issue that, ultimately speaking, owners still have more power in a liberal democracy, a capitalist society. The
In a
nature
political
that
sense, you're saying.
in an economic sense as well, yes, both. It because essentially what I'm getting at is this: by nature, that capital has the kind of power that it has in any society that is capitalist. This includes the Nordic model as well.
Sure.
They will have more influence than the average worker, and that means their voices will be heard more often. And when that doesn't go their way, they have no problems with potentially overthrowing the government, as evidenced by the business plot back in the, I think it was 1930s in here in the United States, where they attempted to basically overthrow FDR through a sort of, I guess you say, like semi-fascist coup or what have you. So
Right.
capital's interest is always going to be disaligned with the average person, the average worker, because they have just different interests. They care about their own class interests more than they care about the sanctity or the sort of longevity of any kind of democratic institution.
Well, sure, but I think you know who else cares about their class interest is labor, right? And that's why throughout time, labor has been able to vote in many democratic and redistributive reforms. Now, I don't agree
Hmm.
that owners have an outsized influence in the economy in the sense that owners, they, I mean, they're owners for a reason. They made the initial investments, and those are their companies, and so I think it's
Okay.
pretty fair and reasonable for them to have some amount of influence. Now, I still believe in things like parity on worker boards, unionization, representation, even third-party union representation, in the most for the most part, which I think would solve a lot of those internal disputes that you might be
Hmm.
not favorable to between workers and capital. But that's possible in a capitalist framework, right? And again, what is true on the political side is that it's proven. We've seen it happen across many different nations that you can have a stable democratic system with the presence of capital in that system. I think when you look at Switzerland or the UK or Norway or even the United States, that gets a lot of flack for the influence of money in our politics, you tend to see a fairly representative government, depending on the actual structure of the government. The U.S. has obviously a kind of a weird sort of way that we elect our president, but in other countries that have a more majoritarian system, you don't really tend to see this incredible outsized influence of capital. Again, it seems quite amicable. I mean, for goodness sakes, the plot that you're talking about failed. It didn't work, right? Because our institutions are very strong.
Well,
Well, really quick, there was a similar plot in the UK against Harold Wilson, a premiership, and that also failed because the institutions in the UK are so strong, institutions that were built on the back of liberal democracy under a capitalist framework.
yeah, so the business plot didn't necessarily fail because the institutions were strong enough. It failed because one of the main people who was going to lead the coup decided to reveal the plot to the institutions who could then combat it. It wasn't that the institutions in and of themselves were so strong that they withstood the plot. It's that someone turned them in essentially. That's what happened. Speaking to the other points, I'll speak more broadly, with my problems with social democracy because I think that's really what we're talking about here. So while I agree that workers on board decisions is preferable and these sorts of reforms are good. My point is that one, simply allowing someone at the seat of the table doesn't mean they actually are eh, ruling the table. So long as capital has this relationship, workers, while they might be given more representation, are not given the same equal footing. And so certain decisions are going to come before theirs. This is where we talk about class interests again. But also more broadly, when it comes to social democracy, you know, my point is that it's not a sustainable model, as I'm going back to earlier. So when we talk about, creating these more equal outcomes and such, these can't withstand capital's interests because I mean, we can just look back to America again because, that's what's most relevant to us. FDR, implemented his great, the New Deal and had all these great programs, like Social Security, bringing about these sorts of programs. But what we've seen is that, capital interests, private interests, um, and I guess also reactionary forces came together over 50, 60 years to undermine those programs and bring them about to what we have today. So while we are able to create these more equitable or fair sort of programs, they're not sustainable because so long as capital exists, it's going to seek to get rid of them because they don't like them, because they're a potential threat to their own interests. So, and I think we can even see this to some of the early stages of this in the Nordic model. If we look to some of the trends they have been going through, some of the ways they view their welfare system, I think they've started to cut it off for more like some of the refugees that have come there. So they started to engage in more sort of welfare chauvinism. Um, so we're starting to see some of the early stages where you're starting to see these more reactionary forces and these more private interests superseding, the democratic values, these sort of social democratic values that these countries are built on. So my point is that, while these programs are preferable and better than what we have now, I don't think they can sustain themselves, and ultimately they don't actually address the main problem, which is this unequal relationship, this sort of um, dominant subordinate relationship that capital has with workers.
Well, again, I don't think I don't know if socialism doesn't get rid of the boss worker relationship. It just relabels it. I don't think that socialism addresses those
Oh,
things either.
we'll have to agree to disagree on that then, because that just antithetical to everything I believe.
Well, I
But go
mean, do
ahead.
you think? Well, for instance, do you think the fact that we vote for president means that the president, like, how do I put this? Like, we vote for a president. It's democratically decided. Technically, he works for us. But would you say that the relationship between an average citizen and the president is equal? Well, I would argue no, because there's obviously a lot of separation between who eventually gets voted in as president and the people that voted them in, because there has to be, right? I mean, that would be my argument between um, that there has to be some necessary hierarchy to socialist systems, but that's obviously beside the fact it's all entirely theoretical. Because it has to be because socialism has not been proven to be robustly democratic, but except for our well, Cuba is an interesting example. They have a really interesting electoral system, but I wouldn't call them democratic. But in general, I would say that I don't know how long a system has to be around for you to call it sustainable. Um, I mean, for instance, the NHS in England is I think like 80 years old or something like that. It's been going around for quite a long time. The healthcare systems of many countries across the world are 50, 60, 70, 80 years old in a decommodified sense. There's a lot of systems in place that are not explicitly not private that would be better for capital owners if they were private that do not get privatized. You look at uh, fire services, police, the military, stuff like that that isn't privatized. You look at many different social welfare programs. Almost every developed country has a social security program that would be better if it was privatized, but um, even the big evil capitalist United States hasn't privatized their social security system. So, and that's been around for almost 100 years. So I just, I'm not sure how you would define what is sustainable and not sustainable. What I would say is that socialism's been tried for 100 years and it's failed for 100 years. So but you're arguing for socialism. I'm arguing for the system that has been proven to create strong institutions and develop them over time. Whereas you're arguing for the system that has been unstable for 100 years.
Okay, so to address this point about the president being separate from the
I think you're
people's interests and acting different now. I agree that there's difference between the president and the average person when they're voted
sure.
in. But the point being is, I'm not sitting here saying that hierarchy is going to be completely abolished under socialism. The point being is that we give workers direct say and direct control over their lives and direct control over, say, of who may hierarchy there. There's some differences. Ultimately, theoretically, maybe not always in practice, the president is going to be, subservient to the will of the people. They are going to listen to what their constituents want and they'll do as they say, supposedly. So when we talk about this and we apply this relationship to socialism, worker democracy, whatever you want to call it still stands. You can say that it's just relabeled, but like it's a relabeled version of boss and workers. But if the boss is, subservient or they have to, listen to what their workers actually have to say, I don't think that's the same at all. Just as it wouldn't be the same to say, oh, we have a leader who's a dictator and we have workers. That's the same as a president. It's just relabeled. Like that's not a fair assessment because there's very clearly different factors going into it. It's a very different relationship in and of itself. Going to your second point, I think you're talking about, um, what would count as a sustainable program, what would count as a sustainable system. You're talking about programs like, or you're asking me like, how long does it take for something to be sustainable or good? You brought up the example of like, I believe the NHS, and I think even now the NHS, it's not I'm not it's well, it's certainly around. It's not like it has just been constant. It's been this good thing. It's always been funded. It's gone through moments, I'm pretty sure, of defunding. And I think even under Boris Johnson, they've been seeking to privatize certain sections of it. So this actually goes back to my original point when it comes to like what happened after the New Deal, where we saw, the gradual but ultimate privatization of a lot of these programs or the defunding of these programs to the point where capital was more comfortable with them. So, in terms of sustainability, once again, this just goes back to my point, which is that so long as capital has the kind of power that it has, it will always act in its own interests that are contrary to workers or even just the average person in general, where they will seek to cut these programs, privatize them as best as they can so they don't have to compete or pay for that sort of thing. And I forgot what was the last thing you said. Oh, I think you're referring to sorry, I won't say that because I'm not sure what you said for the last point. So if you want to address those or restate what you said, then that's fine.
Yeah, no worries. I think that, I think you've brought up a couple examples that I'm not sure necessarily prove your point. So it's true that certain
Sure.
aspects of the NHS are in talks to be privatized or to have private contractors come in. At the end of the day, the state's still paying people's bills, right? I mean, the existence of some private services does not negate the fact that the overwhelming portion of the system is still totally decommodified and totally state run. The NHS is arguably unique in that regard. They have a totally state healthcare system. I believe that the Nordic economy is the same. If you look at Canada, they just have a Medicare style insurance where it's just a state who operates an insurance program, but there's a lot of
Yes.
private carriers. But um, I don't think that
Hmm.
disproves my point. You bring up Medicare and Social Security, which were the two biggest parts of the New Deal. Um, those have only grown over time.
Still
They they
here, yeah.
they literally have exploded in terms of how much we've spent on them. The original payroll tax for Social Security was I think 1%. Well, now it's 6.2%. And Medicare, the original tax for that I think was a quarter percent. Or no, Medicare I think was Medicare. I think Medicare was the 1960s, but um, anyway, that these
Yeah,
programs
they came in the
grow.
60s. Yeah.
Yeah, apologies. But that tax has, I think, also like quintupled. I think it started out as a quarter percent, and now it's like 1.5%, 1.45% matched by the employer. And so, these programs have only grown. Today, they account for, I think it's like 2/3, 60, 70% of everything the government spends on today. The U.S. government, almost 2/3 of it is just those two programs, which are both entitlement programs, which are both redistributive programs. So I think, it's these things don't prove your point. They really serve to prove my point, which fundamentally is just the idea that capitalism is more amicable in terms of its relationship with democracy. At least it's been proven to be that way over time. And again, I think that um, I don't think you've properly addressed the irony of saying that capitalism is unsustainable. Capitalism isn't sustainable. Well, it's been around for 100. Well, I'm sorry. It's been around in its current form broadly for the last 100 years. It's been sustainable. It can build strong institutions. But for the last 100 years of socialism, it hasn't been proven to do the same thing. But you're advocating for socialism, not capitalism. So how do you address that sort of what I would label as irony um, in general?
Your irony, so the ironic question you're asking me is whether or not, how can I advocate for socialism because it's failed over the last 150, whatever you want to say, years, while capitalism has succeeded over the last 100 years? Is that what you're asking me?
You're saying capitalism and its relationship with democracy is unsustainable, but I feel like fairly decently and robustly proven that over the last 100 years that has not been the case. That capitalism is amicable in its relationship with democracy. However, the same cannot be said for socialism. The same cannot be said for socialism. So, how do you reconcile that?
I don't think you've proven that capitalism is any more better at this than the supposed socialist model as you're criticizing. Like I've said before, you know, when capital is threatened, which it has been in the United States, which it has been in plenty of other countries, it will consolidate and it will seek to overturn and overthrow the government in some ways. Not always successful, granted, but it will attempt that, which is a sign that it doesn't really care about these democratic institutions, which indicates it's an unsustainable, or at least contradictory system with democracy.
Well, but
If we are
there's
only
that's
speaking
it,
about the
but really
Norwegian
let,
model,
let me butt
Europe,
in really quick.
then
There's
speaking
never
about, oh yeah, I'll let you. Okay, fine, you go ahead.
well, there's never been
But
a successful example of a revolution in a liberal democracy. It's never happened. And so,
it's how
what do you mean how? It's just there's never,
it
the
hasn't
developed
happened.
yeah, these developed liberal democracies, there's never been there's at the point of transitioning to liberal democracy, there's never been a successful revolution in any of them. The oldest one is the UK. Um, there's never been a revolution in the UK since the Magna Carta was signed. If I'm not mistaken, there was only I think it was like a few months, I think, where Cromwell took over, but he was eventually, again, the institutions kind of came back and he was eventually executed. But you're
What
saying
wait,
that,
what do you think a revolution is exactly?
I guess I'd have to ask you what you think a revolution is. To me, a revolution is, you're saying that, the business class, it doesn't always work when the business class, that implies that it's sometimes worked, but to my knowledge, the business class has never overthrown a government in a developed liberal democracy and replaced you know, replaced the government essentially.
But there have been attempts, which is my point. I'm not saying that every instance has succeeded. The point was the attempt to, and that's
Okay.
intentionality. You don't care about that, right?
Well, I would say, I mean, there have been. I'm not sure why I would care about that. I mean, there have been I mean,
Well,
there have been attempts. Sure, go on. I just don't think why would I care about the attempts when they've not proven to be successful at any turn. That doesn't seem to. Why would I care? I guess if that makes any sense.
well,
Like I'm
the
sure there's
point being,
always some crazy billionaire who's wants to overthrow the government, but I mean, they've never been successful. So I
the
mean, let them.
point that I'm making is that even if something hasn't succeeded, that doesn't mean you should not be concerned with it. And the fact that capital has this tendency to not, you know, be compatible with democracy is a sign that they don't really care about these institutions, and that when their interests are threatened or seriously threatened, they will overturn those institutions that they supposedly care about, right? I mean, I don't think I don't think it'd be fair to say like, "Oh, well, the insurrection on January 6th, it didn't succeed, so who cares? Why should I care?" Well, the point being is that they attempted to do so, and they have that intentionality to overthrow the government and install their own kind of government, or reinstate the old one, whatever you want to say. And that is incompatible with democracy. That is a threat, and that should be taken seriously. So even if it didn't succeed, right? The fact that they are willing to do so and have that intention is a potential threat. It is something to be concerned with. right? That is a sign of something that could be unsustainable, right?
So I would say that it's not that it's not a concern in the moment. Of course, anytime someone advocates for the overthrow of a government, that is a problem. But what you said originally wasn't true. You know, you said capital has a tendency to be unsustainable in terms of its relationship with democracy. What I have,
Mhm.
I think, proven is that's not the case. Right? There have been many different instances of developed capitalist democracies being fairly robust, fairly representative, high turnout, high interest in elections, redistributive in nature, progressive in taxation, um, and able to effectively manage that relationship between capital and labor. But you haven't answered the alternative, which is that the relationship that has been proven to exist between socialism and democracy in the last 100 years has been wholly unsustainable. There has not been an example of a large, sustainable, democratic, socialist government uh, in the last 100 years, or since socialism's sort of come into being as a form of thought. You haven't answered that criticism, but I feel like I've properly answered the fact that no, it's not true. Capital has been amicable to democracy um, for, I would argue, a sustainable period of time. 100 years is quite a long time for an institution to develop. But you haven't answered the criticism that I've levied, which is that socialism and democracy has not proven to be amicable towards each other. It's been proven to be, unfortunately for your case, quite the opposite.
Okay. So what I would say then is that, I guess to more directly address your critique, um, yes, it's true that lots of socialist projects that we point to and look at have not been the most democratic, or they haven't been the most compatible in some ways or another with our conception of democracy. What I'll say though is that while there have not been many great examples of this, this doesn't, once again, my whole point is that it's more so looking to the horizons and seeking to build something more than what we have. So, yes, there have been bad examples. I'm not disputing that. My point has always been it's not a question of just looking to examples or looking to the past. Those are important, and it's important to keep those in mind. But in terms of the critique, for me, it has and always has come down to it's just a matter of a moral principle. It's not just that, when we look to like a Marxist Leninist model, yes, there are problems with it, but what are they getting right in some ways? What are the underlying issues with it, and what can we take away from them? And the fact of the matter is that whatever problems you have with them, and I do have problems with some of the earlier socialist models, ultimately speaking, they're getting at something that's very important, and that is, so long as capital has power in our society the way it does, this is not sustainable with democracy in some ways. Even with the examples that you brought up of Norwegian or just European social democracies, we're already seeing trends, I think, in some ways that there's some degree of I guess you could say, tension between capital workers, early stages of it. So my point is that we should seek to reconcile those differences in some ways. But for me, at least, I don't think that such differences can be reconciled um, with these, at least within the framework of capital. We have to move beyond it in some ways, and thus we have to kind of implement something that is more, I guess you could say, in line with our values, more in line with our moral values, while also not returning to the past. So that means creating a system that is more democratic, that is more open, that is more ultimately socialist, but not in the same sense. Socialist in the sense that actually returning power to workers, both in the workplace, but also in the government more so. So it isn't just that we elect certain people to represent us, it's that workers have a direct say over the government more so than before, i.e., something like workers actually running the government in some ways. That's a little far off, I admit, but ultimately speaking, that is what my values, that is what the values of people would lead them to say. Socialism isn't just a couple of bad examples in the past, or many bad examples, if you want to say so. It's about an ideal that we strive for and that we should try to seek in the world. It's just a moral principle. That's ultimately what I'm getting at.
That's fair. To finish this off, B for Vendetta did say that in him is more than an idea, and ideas are bulletproof. So I think that you have a strong point in that regard. Socialism could be um, Who knows? Maybe with technological advancements, um, something resembling socialism could be more sustainable in the future. I don't know if that would be possible. I don't know if I agree to that, but I guess my final point would be that I think that if your values, as you originally said, are freedom, individual liberty, life that is free from coercion, I think that a capitalist framework can bring the individual and the collective closer to that sort of theoretical construct that is free from coercion than a socialist framework could, um, in my opinion.